Have you ever seen a movie called Charlie Wilson's War? Well, it tells the story of U.S. Representative from Texas, Charlie Wilson, and CIA operative Gust Avrakatos and their work together to implement Operation Cyclone, a program to organize to support the Afghan mujahideen during the Soviet-Afghan War. You know the mujahideen, right? They were the Afghan guerrilla fighters who fought against the Soviet army that deployed to Afghanistan to defend the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan's government during that war. And the war was the result of a power struggle created when the last king of Afghanistan, Mohammad Zahir Shah, established a constitutional monarchy under which the House of the People was to have 216 elected members and the House of the Elders was to have 84 members, 1/3 elected by the people, 1/3 appointed by the king, and 1/3 elected indirectly by new provincial assemblies. Elections to fill the seats saw candidates with platforms that ran the ideological gamut from fundamentalist Islam to Marxism, which is what the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or the PDPA, were. But the king refused to implement constitutionally guaranteed policies that stalled the implementation of the very political processes that he guaranteed in the Constitution that he wrote, which resulted in a power struggle, which the PDPA won in a coup they backed that installed Mohammed Daoud Khan as president in 1973, dissolving the monarchy and the Constitution. But then Khan filled his cabinet not with PDPA members who helped him overthrow Zahir Shah, but with sycophants, friends, and even some members of the former royal party. And of course, members of the PDPA didn't like this, so of course, they couped Daoud Khan 5 years later in 1978 and established the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, or the DRA. The mujahideen arose from mostly rural Afghans who had more traditional cultures and practices, so they were in opposition to the Marxist government, whose policies included eliminating usury, ensuring equal rights for women, instituting land reforms because they disrupted the centuries-long traditional cultures in the more remote areas of the country. And they also didn't want to be controlled by the Soviet Union, which was in line with Afghanistan's long history of non-alignment with any nation, although the PDPA was careful not to call themselves communists or Marxists. They called themselves democratic socialists or just socialists and declared that they adhered to Afghan nationalism, Islamic principles, socio-economic justice, non-alignment in foreign affairs, and respect for all agreements and treaties signed by the previous Afghan governments. But the mujahideen were not convinced, and they organized a rebel force against the PDPA-led government. And at this point, the government did request help from the Soviet Union to control the growing rebel opposition, often brutally. And that is how the Red Army became mired in a losing war in Afghanistan for 9 years. Now back to Representative Charlie Wilson. It was Operation Cyclone, initiated by Representative Wilson, that armed the mujahideen against the Soviet army. And of course, this wasn't done because Wilson thought the Afghans had a right to self-determination. He did it because they were fighting against a communist government and the Cold War enemies of the U.S., the Soviet Union. Oh, Wilson claimed that he was moved to help the Afghan rebels after he visited a refugee camp in Pakistan and saw the Afghani children with their hands blown off from Soviet mines. But I don't buy that. Because as Operation Cyclone was growing, Selig Harrison, former journalist for the Washington Post and author of 5 books on U.S. Asian affairs, said that he met with CIA leaders who told him, quote, these people were fanatical, and the more fierce they were, the more fiercely they would fight the Soviets, but that he warned these very CIA officials that he met with that the U.S. was creating a monster. Of course, they didn't listen. And the Taliban emerged from this larger group of mujahideen framed in Western media as Muslim recruits from any and every Islamic school, in effect smearing madrasas, which are just Islamic schools, and Islam itself as training grounds for terrorism. But in truth, many leaders of the Taliban were on the payroll of the Inter-Services Intelligence, the ISI, the intelligence wing of the Pakistani government. And you know who ISI were buddies with and funded by, don't you? The CIA. So the U.S. funneled money to agents of the fanatical Pakistani secret police, basically, who became the Taliban. Now, because of Charlie Wilson's lobbying for arms for the Mujahideen, the CIA's anti-communism budget grew from $5 million to over $500 million during that time, and was a significant impetus behind the Reagan Doctrine, through which the U.S. armed anti-communist movements around the world. But when the Soviets were finally driven out of Afghanistan in 1989, what happened? Civil war. That's what happened. Even as the Soviet army was gradually withdrawing forces from the country. Where was the U.S. and Charlie Wilson and all that aid? It was non-existent. After the Soviet army withdrew, the U.S. left other entities to clean up the mess they funded in the country. Charlie Wilson and the CIA didn't care that the money and the weapons they poured into arming the Mujahideen were now being used on Afghan civilians by those same groups. Oh, the movie tries to paint Wilson as trying to lobby Congress to help the Afghans after the war, but I don't buy that either. Because you mean to tell me that one man can make the CIA spend $500 million to arm rebels in another country, but he can't get a few $100 million, maybe even a few million to rebuild some roads? Get out of here. So the Taliban, being the major organized, funded, and armed force among the Mujahideen, ultimately took control of approximately 3/4 of Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001, in the vacuum left by the Soviet army and U.S. assistance of the Mujahideen against it. And they brutalized women, children, destroyed religious artifacts, and oppressed religious and ethnic minorities the whole time. I don't think that part is in the movie. And Charlie Wilson and the United States and the CIA did nothing until a month after the attacks on the U.S. on September 11, 2001, when George W. Bush invaded Afghanistan. Now, 20 years later, the Biden State Department emphatically denies that the embassy evacuation fiasco is absolutely not like Saigon, which is absolutely arguable because it absolutely is, while simultaneously making clear why the U.S. military went into Afghanistan 20 years ago. Quote, "We went with one mission in mind, and that was to deal with the people who attacked us on 9/11, and that mission has been successful." End quote. All the talk about protecting Afghani women and children that emerged after 2001, and much of it floating around now, is deeply suspect to me, because who cared about those people between 1996 and 2001? Do we believe that 20 years of U.S.-led war was good for Afghani women and children? Was it good for them that the U.S. armed the Mujahideen and left them to fight for control of those women and children in the towns and cities they lived in with the Stinger missiles and other military hardware that the U.S. dumped into the country to fight the Soviets? Of course, women and children are in danger in Afghanistan. Of course, the Taliban are monsters, and it's entirely possible that they will be just as brutal as they were before. And yes, the U.S. has used and abandoned the Afghani people twice now in less than 50 years. But considering the fact that the U.S. is largely responsible for the existence of the Taliban in the first place, I hardly think we should be expecting them to fix what they broke, especially since they refuse to admit what they've done at all. And then they have the gall to call the horror they've created a success. Oh, the movie Charlie Wilson's War, starring Tom Hanks, by the way, it's a comedy drama. Think about that. Hollywood thought that this whole thing was funny. Are you laughing? Follow Luqman Nation on patreon.com/LuqmanNation for lots of great content.